Hi, and welcome to this overview of Marxism. Now, this is a very basic introduction to Marxism. It's not going to be too complex, but I've particularly created this for history students who need to develop a basic understanding of some of the ideas of Marxism because they are so important in the development of political ideas through the 19th century and certainly into the 20th century, with so many political ideas and communist revolutions all going back and saying that they're embedded, they're built on what Marxism was. So this is a bit of an introduction to help us understand what Marxism actually is. So let's start by saying, well, who is Karl Marx? So Karl Marx is a guy, that's him on the right with the beard. He's a German philosopher, economist, sociologist, historian, activist, and he wrote a lot of things. He's basically a bit of an academic. But the thing that he's most well known for is something called the Communist Manifesto. And he wrote this together with his friend academic, Friedrich Engels. And they're writing together in Germany in 1848. And this thing, it's not even a whole book, it's a pamphlet. Okay, reasonably short, easy to read pamphlet. And it becomes so influential. It's the most widely published and read piece of political ideology through the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th century. So small pamphlet, big impact. So if that's Marx, what then is Marxism? Okay, so it's the Communist Manifesto is about these ideas of communism in particular, but it's really important to understand that Marx did not invent those ideas. Ideas of socialism, communism, alternative forms of political society, they'd been around for some time. And certainly Marx was not even the first person to suggest that there would be a revolution by workers to move into a socialist type society. But what the Communist Manifesto did was took quite a lot of the ideas that were around at the time, put them together in a fairly easy to read pamphlet. And one of the most important ideas was that Marx looked at it through a historical lens. So he was saying, here we are at this point in time in 1848, and he looked back at how history has been in the past, and then he predicted what would happen next. And the thing about Marx is he predicted that it was inevitable that communism would develop in society. And that was quite different to say that this was absolutely going to happen. These ideas all together form what we call Marxism, these kinds of ideas of this historical development of society and what would happen next. How influential are these ideas about Marxism? Well, this is a piece of propaganda from the Soviet period, and certainly Marx has a big impact on the development of the Russian Revolution. That's Marx on the right, Engels in the middle, and Lenin, who gets his own ism by the time we get to the late 1920s. And so Marx has a huge impact on the development of, a fairly significant state through the 20th century. But it's not just the Soviet Union, of course, because all of those communist revolutions that take place in the 20th century, go back to say that their roots come from Marx, and certainly use Marx's work to justify some of the things that they do. We've got here Karl Marx on the floor doing a bit of a rap and welcoming everybody to the Communist Party. We can talk later about whether or not these guys, Lenin, Mao, Fidel Castro and Stalin, how well they put Marx's ideas into place. That's a different story though. So while that's who Marx is, we understand where they've come from. What exactly are his ideas? And that's what we need to look at now. And as I said, one of the things about Marx is he looks at it from an historical point of view, but not only history, but also a historical economy. Everything for him is in terms of relationships between classes and the fact that these classes are struggling, fighting against each other to control wealth and ownership of things. So it's a class struggle for control of the economy. And one of the things, so it's always about class struggle, okay? if we have a look over here at our little graphs, this is like a chronology, a timeline you might see. And what Marx has done is he's looked at the past, at feudalism, and said, look, this was a form of society, and he talks about what went on there. But feudalism eventually collapses and creates a new economic system of capitalism. And that's what he's seeing in 1848. He's looking around him and he's seeing capitalism. And what he's saying is that this, while there's some good things about it, it cannot last. Not will not, but it cannot last. It will not last, and it will be replaced eventually by a revolution and moving into a socialist society. But socialism is not the aim. In fact, communism is the aim, and communism was seen, therefore, as kind of the last part of history that societies would eventually move into a communist system. Let's take a closer look at each of these stages. Okay, so if we go into feudalism, and you might remember the old power pyramid of power here, showing you medieval society with the king on top, the landowners up here, our nobles, and then the vast majority of the people actually being the peasants. And so this was an agricultural based society. You've got the state, basically the monarch, the king, or the queen, or the emperor. And the wealth is mostly connected with the land. And that went on for quite some time and worked quite well as an economic system. But eventually we start to see the development of a new class, which fits in just here, and it's a class basically in medieval times called the freemen. And the freemen started to grow in numbers and created a new middle class, basically merchants, traders who were not a part of the old economic system of the feudal ties. And so feudalism started to break down. And if you have a look at medieval history, the plague, all those sorts of things, feudalism does eventually crack down, dissolves, but in its place we see a very new kind of system, and that is capitalism. Capitalism, of course, is a system that relies very heavily on the Industrial Revolution, but it's driven very much not by the upper class so much anymore, but the development of a new bourgeoisie that is a middle class. Okay, so here we've got, you might have seen pictures like this before. Down the bottom, all the workers who are basically holding up the rest of society, but they're not being treated very well, are they? While we've got pretty much our bourgeoisie, our middle class here in the middle, eating on behalf of the whole of society, but they are eating because of the labour that is going into the development of the society that's coming from the working class down here, all the way up to the top. So what Marx is saying is that during the capitalist period, the class struggle starts to become between the bourgeoisie, the middle class, and the urban working class in particular, who have all come to the cities, working in the factories. He calls them the proletariat. And these words, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, are really important terms in Marxism. It's basically the middle class, becomes the ruling class versus the working class. But what happens in capitalism is this. Not only does the bourgeoisie and the upper classes, they own everything. So everything is owned by individuals and private companies. And they therefore get to control who all the wealth gets distributed to, which means nobody except for themselves, because they keep things for themselves. So while a lot of wealth is being generated by a very efficient capitalist system, all of the labour that's going into it is coming from the working classes, but then being held, contained, and used only by the middle classes. So if we go down to this red box down the bottom, this is what's happening. The proletariat, the urban working class, are working really hard to generate this new wealth for society, but in turn their working and living conditions are actually getting worse. They've got crowded accommodation, illness is spreading, it's long working hours, it's unsafe, low wages. It's a terrible time for the working class. And in 1848, that's what Marx and Engels are seeing around them in Germany, also in Britain. They're seeing a really trodden down working class. And what Marx is saying is this cannot last. It cannot last. This period of capitalism, while it's generating huge amounts of wealth, it's not distributing evenly, and this class struggle will eventually turn into a revolution. The working classes will, remember he's saying they will rise up, and there will be a revolution, and we will move from a capitalist stage into a new stage, which is kind of called socialism. All right, so the revolution takes place, and instead of the bourgeoisie and the upper classes controlling the government, we now have the working classes, and this is what we call a dictatorship of the proletariat. So they're creating a new state, replacing the old one, but running it in a different way. And one of the most important differences is about ownership of property. No longer is it held by individuals, but it's held by the state. So the state now owns what we call the means of production, how we create things, and they're also in charge of distributing the wealth of society. And in this stage, we're looking at distributing according to people's contribution. And the idea of this is to give the working class a better share of what they have generated in terms of wealth. The idea is that we're going to remove class barriers, treat people equally, and eventually we'll have better living and working conditions for everybody, more equality, greater fairness, all of these kinds of ideas. But it does involve the creation of a state to actually get those things happening and start to change the ownership. But socialism is not the be-all and end-all, because what Marx was actually talking about is moving to communism. So socialism was seen as a temporary phase, an intermittent kind of thing that was going to happen. It wasn't going to be a short phase, but eventually what Marx saw was that society would move to the final stage, communism. So communism is kind of this much nicer kind of idea. And by this stage, there's no need for the state anymore because people are so used to living in communally, sharing things. There's not even really a concept of ownership so much anymore. Resources are still being created very effectively, but they're also being distributed equally so that all classes are equal. It's a very fair, very harmonious community. And the picture here, from the 1890s gives you this sense of this almost utopian kind of society. Now, right now you may be saying to me, that's a bit unrealistic. Would people really ever give up ownership? Would people really ever live fairly together? Good. Keep asking those questions. Definitely ask those questions. But at the same time, I want you to think from the perspective of a worker in the 19th century, in crowded conditions, poor, very poor wages, poor outlook on life, illnesses, poorly educated. This communism idea sounds pretty good. It doesn't sound good for anybody who already owns and has power, but it certainly sounds good to many workers. Whether or not the ideas of Marxism were properly put into place through these so-called communist revolutions, that's another thing to think about as well. That's a completely different issue. What we've been talking about here today is the theory of Marxism, not the practice of communism as we saw it in the 20th century. And that's a really important thing to get your head around. So today, it's the theory. It's Marx and Engels, what they've seen in the past, talking about history as different economic systems, as a series of class struggles, and predicting that inevitably capitalism could not last, and what would come next would be a socialist society, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then finally a communist society with no state, no classes, no concept of ownership, because everything is being done communally. So that's my overview of Marxism. I hope it helps. I hope it also raises more questions for you, and I'm sure that you'll go on to answer a lot of those in your history studies.